Okay, I'll finally manage to get in, so that is certainly a positive development. Good morning, Congressman Frank.
Good morning.
I'm sitting here in Hong Kong, Uwe Park.
What time is it? What time are you at?
At the same time, 8 p.m.
12 hours.
12 hours exactly.
I once got a watch from the government of Taiwan on a trip, and they said it's got two times on it, Taiwan and Washington. And of course, it was the same, with AM and PM. Oh, okay, that's helpful.
We don't have daylight savings time kind of thing here, so for that
Ours
reason,
goes off in 10 days.
yeah, right. So
Daylight
that's
savings time expires in week from Saturday.
right. I guess we're still waiting for a few people to get involved here.
Okay, I think it's ready to go.
We're ready to go? Okay, well, good evening, everybody here in Asia, and good morning in the United States, and good afternoon on points in between. I'm Uwe Park, the editor of Asia Times. We are based in Hong Kong. We are honored today to welcome Congressman Frank from the state of Massachusetts, who was a congressman for 32 years, I believe, for 16 terms. Perhaps a record, I don't know.
No. There were a number in the 40s.
Really? Okay.
John Dingell was 50 years.
My goodness. All right. Anyway, 32 years is quite astonishing, and never defeated. So perhaps for people around the world, Congressman Frank is best known for the Dodd-Frank Act, but maybe I should say Frank-Dodd Act.
Oh no,
that he
if we called Frank Dodd, the assumption would have been that that was a man named Frank Dodd who had done the work.
There you go. That makes sense. This is of course, the premier financial regulatory act that was promulgated in the United States after the 2008-2009 debilitating financial crisis. It put into law a great deal of consumer protection legislation for financial service behavior, if you will. It also was famous for the so-called Volcker Rule, which put severe restrictions on proprietary speculative trading. It also, of course, restricted, or rather put into the light of day, the infamous credit default swaps, which many people blame for accelerating the crisis in 2008. So that's Congressman Frank. We are deeply honored to have him with us and tell us this evening what he thinks Joe Biden will do if indeed he were to be elected president on November 3rd. With that, David, I'll turn it over to you for initiating a little bit of a Q&A here. Thank you.
Thank you, Uwe. I'm David Goldman, deputy editor of Asia Times. Congressman, it's an honor to see you again. Why is this election different from all other elections? In the many decades you've been in politics, I'm sure you've seen nothing quite like this. The volatility of the polls, the invective coming from both sides, the degree of polarization is quite extraordinary in American politics. And before digging into the policy details, I'd like to hear your personal impression of the kind of election we're going through and what it means for the United States.
David, I'm glad to. Let me, you asked that question. I thought of our common religious heritage. You were asking me in the words of the Passover, Manish Tanaha election Hazeh. That's
Right.
the four questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? Well, this election is really very different from all other nights. And I think, frankly, for us, it's going to be celebrating an exodus, which is the exodus of Republicans from positions of power in Washington, D.C. This looks like an election that will be very good for the Democrats. And I guess to carry the metaphor to intolerable lengths, we think we can divide the red states in a number of places. The reason it is different, twofold. The immediate manifestation is Donald Trump. He continues now to be totally different than anybody else who's ever run for president like this in his self-defeating approach. The Wall Street Journal, the intellectual leader of sort of conservative republicanism, unlike Fox News, which is the kind of rowdier counterpart, they are more and more now just frankly very unhappy that he's running in a way that destroys himself. The answer is this, what makes him different? First of all, he understood, and that gets to the second reason. I should have started with this. What we are seeing now in the world is the failure of policymakers in the developed world to react appropriately to the fact that starting in the 80s and steadily since, massive wealth inequality has become the hallmark of contemporary capitalism. And that has destabilized politics. Mostly it has given support to the right, but also to the left. It's the explanation of Jeremy Corbyn. It's the explanation of the strength of Bernie Sanders. And Trump capitalized in 2016 on the fact that the Democrats, and historically we've been the party that wanted to deal with inequality, but again, it's a tribute to the whole John Maynard Keynes had on the world and on the left, that as inequality became more and more of an issue, we continued to focus on growth. And growth used to be a good thing when it was fairly widely shared. But as growth came to benefit fewer and fewer people, it no longer played that role. And so Trump capitalized, as others have been doing, as the anti-Brexit people did, Farage, as Le Pen has made strides doing, they capitalized on the anger about the increasing inequality. And so he was able to run on that platform, denouncing everything, shattering a lot of the tradition. And one of the things that's happened in this is traditional conservatism, sort of free market conservatism, has basically been shredded. It really is in trouble everywhere in the world. You have a somewhat disorganized or split left fighting a more angry right. And so Trump, free trade or a number of other issues, he has simply abandoned. And his approach, for instance, in agricultural policy, is he's pursuing an aggressive trade war that's hurt the farmers. And so we have been paying them $20 and $30 billion a year in taxpayer subsidy to make up for the damage. So that's what it has been. It has been Trump's capitalizing successfully on the anger that the average citizen has had about the fact that they're being told that growth is wonderful and they don't get any.
So how do we fix it? Let's assume there's a blue sweep. President Biden is there at the end of January. He's got both houses, can do whatever he wants. He wants to roll back the corporate tax cut that Trump introduced a couple of years ago. He wants
the upper end of that.
Taxes. Sorry?
Yeah, he wants to roll back the part that.
Right. So how do you promote more equality or better distribution of income without killing the goose that lays the golden eggs? We've got a big deficit of investment and productivity. The Biden campaign has talked about the need to restore America's technological edge, a number of other, restore infrastructure and so forth. How do you square that circle? How do you get growth that is more equally distributed?
I should say there was I was asked that question 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, when Bill Clinton proposed in 1993 a significant tax increase on upper income people. In fact, our chief statistical referee, the Congressional Budget Office on National Policy, at the end of the Clinton term said for the first time in years, income distribution had become somewhat less unequal. And no one's talking about anything approaching equality. We are talking about inequality that is necessary for a capitalist economy, but it's gotten out of hand. And Clinton proposed a significant increase on taxes almost entirely on upper income people. And consequently, we had a very good economy. And whether it's causal or not, I think that helped. Basically, it helped in this sense. The strategy of the Clinton people was, I didn't fully agree with it, if he were to reduce the deficit, and higher taxes went mostly in that case to reducing the deficit. Clinton did not use that money to fund much of a program increase, especially after his healthcare plan was defeated by a Democratic Congress, by the way, because we have more party discipline now, but we're still not at the level of some countries. But Clinton basically had a deal with Alan Greenspan, who was then running the Federal Reserve, who he continued in office. Greenspan was, of course, originally a Reagan appointee. And it was that if you got the deficit down, interest rates would stay low. And so that meant, in part, that the borrowing, as we have today, even more so, you could borrow more cheaply. That's a very important factor in increased spending. The second thing is, it turns out that if you do it right, reducing inequality becomes an important gain for growth, because consumption is the largest part of our economy. And we had this again after the Trump tax cuts. Much of the tax cut that goes to the wealthiest people is put into savings. And I believe today that we have more of a savings glut in the world than an investment deficit. So that there's really very little sign that the Trump tax cut of 2017, which was largely for upper income people, was stimulative of the economy. One of the best stimuli we got of the economy was when there was an agreement a few years back to suspend the payroll tax for a couple of years. And that just all got spent. So that's one thing. If you do it right, when you diminish inequality, you substantially increase consumption. Secondly, I think there is an economic consensus now that the economy is much less vulnerable to high levels of government debt, particularly American government debt, than people thought. That doesn't mean it's inconsequential, but we have been for some years now at levels of debt that conventional economics 10 years ago would have told you would be outlandish inflation. And so what we have seen is a deficit of $3 billion in this fiscal year because so much money was spent to stimulate the economy and ward off the economic effects of the pandemic. And I think almost every economist outside of, say, the Wall Street Journal editorial board thinks that was a good thing, not just in moral terms and helping people, but for the economy.
Congressman, I know from a little bit of history that Alan Greenspan was probably not your most favorite citizen.
No, I'd like to be careful. I greatly admire Alan as a citizen. I thought he was not very good as chairman of the Fed.
Okay, fine. All right, then let's talk about the Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan. Today, he, at the age of 94, astonishing, gave an interview with Bloomberg in which he actually addressed the issue that we were just talking about. And one thing he said is, it's not so important necessarily how much we spend, but the question is, or how much or how far we go into debt, what we go into debt for. And he's mostly concerned about what he called a potential catastrophic decline in US productivity if we spend whatever we borrow principally on what and Bernanke used to call helicopter money, showering it onto people for increasing consumption, rather than on investment to create new jobs, on investment to create higher productivity development. And which way would Joe Biden look at that type of equation?
The answer is both. And the fact is that, in the first place, increasing consumption, given that there are a substantial number of people in this country who are not able to consume what you and I would consider a decent amount, so helping them consume is good, but it's also economically good. And here's the problem. This extreme supply side, let's just get more investment. When Henry Ford, the first, who was a notorious anti-Semite and wacko in some ways, but a great industrialist, when he raised the wage of workers in the 20s in his factory, I think it was to $5 a day, people said, that's crazy. Why are you paying them so much? And he said, because there have to be some people who will buy the cars we make. He understood that heavy investment in great production with insufficient consumption didn't make sense. And that's the answer I would give to Greenspan. First of all, if consumption lags because people don't have money, then the people aren't going to invest. You invest primarily, if you're a business person, because you see a way to make money by selling your product. And when sales are depressed, when consumption is low, then there are some products you won't do. And I think that's, again, what happened with the Trump tax cut did not produce that great increase. Secondly, what Biden will do is a much better job than the Republicans have been doing in spending it wisely. The number one priority, I think you will see in spending, well, there are two from the Biden administration. One will be to increase healthcare, to give people a chance to participate in the federal system if they want to. By the way, that is a boon to the workers, but it's also a boon to the employers who have been paying a heavy price for that. Secondly, though, the equal priority for the Democrats will be infrastructure. You talk about spending to increase productivity. Sometimes people just assume. I remember somebody in England back when they were debating joining the what was then the common market said, look, some of my people talk about productivity as if it was a contagious disease. If we join the common market, we'll get it by osmosis. Productivity is a physical thing in many ways. American productivity suffers greatly now from our insufficient infrastructure, delays at airports, traffic jams, inadequate rail, all of those. One of the things that you will see early on in the Biden administration, especially if there was a Democratic House and Senate, is a multi-trillion-dollar plan over the next few years to substantially increase the infrastructure. That means significant transportation increases, and that's productivity when you're freeing up time for people. Secondly, he will invest significantly as part of that in alternative energy sources. And the problem is climate change has become a constraint in some ways. If all your energy is being produced in ways that deteriorate the climate, you're constrained to the extent that you build up ways of generating energy that have no negative climate impact. You've freed up again more stuff. So that's the second thing. Third, I think you will see in the Biden case, education spending, particularly today. Economic investment, increasing productivity means increasing education spending. So those are the things that will be done. There will be some consumption spending, and diminishing inequality is important. And that's the last point I'll make. And I've argued this with a lot of my conservative friends, that redistribution greater than we've seen is in their interest, because it's clear the lack of opposition, inequality has been increasing, and it makes people very mad. And I have to say to the business people, if you're happy that Donald Trump took over the Republican Party, that Bernie Sanders has had such an influence in the Democratic Party, that Jeremy Corbyn was running the Labour Party, that Marianne Le Pen and others have had such an influence, then keep doing what you're doing. Use your power to say no redistribution, we're just going to bet on increasing investment and increasing the output, and it'll take care of itself. I think the democracy, I think, has been at risk. And John Maynard Keynes saved democracy from the anger of the Great Depression. And this danger of xenophobic populism had gone away in the late part of the 20th century, what the French call the Trente Glorieux, the glorious 30s. But by the 80s, given the way technology and globalization has taken effect, there's been the opposite trend. And I think that the failure, particularly of the left, I'm giving you the preview of my new book now, to adapt Keynes's theory appropriately to the inequality that's now characterizing capitalism, is at the root of this revolt against open democracy. And again, I don't know many businessmen who think that Trump and Corbyn and Sanders and Le Pen and their ideological confreres, Salvini in Italy, that's been good. So I think it is and again, I think a lot of people now understand, well, a number of conservatives in America in the 30s, a lot of conventional economists thought Roosevelt was going to wreck things. He preserved capitalism. And that's why, because of the large-scale adoption of Keynes's approach, things went well. The problem, of course, is that Keynes said growth, because the problem at that point was insufficient total production. When the problem shifted from insufficient total production to not good distribution of that production as an equal problem, the world didn't react. And I think that's so that, again, if Alan Greenspan were making economic policy today, I think Trump's going to lose, and he's going to lose because of his personality. But the factors that brought Trump to office are not going away. And people will make a great mistake. I've been arguing this to some of the more moderate Democrats, to assume that when Trump loses, as I believe he will, that that sentiment is no longer a threat is a grave mistake.
Congressman, you talked about the change in attitude towards xenophobia. China and America's trade war, tech war with China, of course, a topic of enormous importance to most of our, if not all of our listeners. A number of people close to the Biden campaign, former Obama administration officials, have been very critical about Trump's stance towards China. You yourself just criticized his trade war policy. Kurt Campbell, for example, who was a senior State Department official under Obama, has said that although we do need to be vigilant about protecting intellectual property and preventing theft, a comprehensive bans on technological change with China would be self-defeating. Would you see a significant change or a change in particular areas in U.S.-Chinese relations under a Biden administration? Before you answer, let me remind our listeners that there's a question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In about 10 minutes, we will be taking your questions. So please think of them and submit them in writing on the Q&A function. Thank you.
I think American policy towards China is one of the areas where you will see the least change in a Biden administration from the Trump policies. And there are two reasons. The first is China. And the fact is that China, particularly under Xi, has been irresponsible and abusive. Their record of human rights is terrible. Their repudiation of their promise to Hong Kong, the treatment of the Uyghurs, awful. The crackdown on any kind of open discussion. And the problem is this, and Joe Biden, it's one of the things Joe Biden has to deal with. The world establishment in the 90s made the mistake of thinking that the best way to deal with China was to allow it to be treated as a relatively free market, even before it was, because that would help the transition to that. And the single most damaging thing that happened to American workers in the last 20 years was the admission of China to the World Trade Organization. There's a consensus, even among more conservative economists, that costs America a lot of jobs. David O'Toole and others at MIT have documented that. And essentially what happened was the rest of the world and the Obama administration thought, oh, this is going to make China more open economically, and that will lead them to be more open politically. Neither one has happened. And the Chinese have stolen technology, and they have been abusive. And yes, I think Trump has handled it badly, but the fundamental problem is there's a real problem there. Secondly, there's a factor I talked about. Biden here, more than any other area, will be constrained by the outrage that most Americans feel, I mean literally most, about the way the economy has grown and fewer people have shared it. I think Biden will be better at it. I think what you will see is more emphasis on working with India and Japan, those allies. I think there will be, yes, as you quoted Campbell, not so much of a comprehensive ban, but maybe an effort to do things. But the question is, look, and I want to avoid the, oh, let's just blame America or blame Trump. A lot depends on China. China is the major source of instability in the world today. It's economic policy. You can't blame Trump for Australia's problems with China. You can't blame Trump for the China-India border war. Chinese behavior has got to change or there will be no great relaxation. I think Biden will administer that in a more rational manner. One of the interesting things about Trump is, for a man who's supposed to be such an excellent chief executive by his own description, the most important thing a chief executive does of a very large operation is appoint people. Donald Trump has the worst record for appointing people anybody's ever seen. In the area of national security, his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, his national security advisors, by his definition, he's appointed incompetent people to all the most important jobs in government. That includes, by the way, the Federal Reserve, and now he's on the second Attorney General who he's attacking. But to go back to the national security thing, I think you will see an effort to try to persuade China that they have to change, and resistance to Chinese policies that have been detrimental, but administered more thoughtfully and more in conjunction with allies. But I'll go back again and say, you're not going to see any significant change until China changes its behavior.
Congressman, if we look at that from the standpoint of a competition, especially in the high technology field, is not part of this whole trouble between China and the United States the situation in which China has very, very rapidly come to a level that nobody expected it to achieve as fast as it did, while at the same time, the United States has not on the level of education, not on the level of technology investment, not on the level of actually developing new technologies.
Can I ask you a question?
Well,
who's stealing whose technology? Is America stealing Chinese technology? In other words, from the standpoint of who's got the best technology? If that technology is so good, why do they steal American technology? And you know they do that. It's been so unfair the way they have not allowed openness. So I reject that premise. Secondly, if China was open and was doing well, I don't regard this. There's no reason for the U.S. and China to be a zero-sum situation. In fact, the more the Chinese people consume, the better we are. The more they send us products that are made reasonably and are less expensive, the world general welfare goes up. But in the technology area in particular, the Chinese have been abusive, and they gained it quickly. And the fact is that technology suppression of the Americans has been a big part. So no, I don't think that's been the problem. The other problem is the belligerence in the region, militarizing these islands. Is America's technological slowness the reason that Vietnam has problems with China, that India has problems with China, that Australia has problems with China? No, China's caused most of its own problems by its behavior.
Congressman, the moment you talked about mutually beneficial relations between the U.S. and China as at least part of this, I'm sure lights went on among many of our listeners because that's what the Chinese try to argue back against American protectionism. If you were to advise the Chinese government to do, say, 3 things to improve relations with the United States upon the presumed ascension of the Biden administration, what would they be?
First, stop the restrictions and that lead to the theft of American technology. Allow American companies to operate freely in China without having to give up their technology, allow them to own things, and just treat foreign investment in China fairly. Second, there is a human rights component. I think, and the 2 outstanding issues are Hong Kong and the Uyghurs, and moderate that. And third, diminish the military belligerence and the excessive claims in the China Sea.
Since your field of expertise is financial regulation, would you see the opening of the Chinese market to American financial firms, BlackRock, JP Morgan, many others are now creating 100% owned subsidiaries for the first time, and many capital market laws are being liberalized. Would you see that as a positive step in this direction?
Not a major one. I mean, I think it'd be a good thing. I obviously am in touch with the financial community, not as much as I used to be. As I said, I never went to Congress with the idea that I was going to do something about derivatives. It was not one of my number 1 goals. And in fact, when I retired, I rephrased in my mind an old anti-war song, "Ain't gonna study derivatives no more." But the complaints, I didn't get many complaints from them about China. That was, they were doing fine. It's in the technology area that they have to open up. I think it would be a good thing for them and us if they opened up more financially. But that has not been either a source of the complaints that we get, nor I think a serious problem. It may be in part that it's, again, when it's this, what JP Morgan do and BlackRock do, there's not the kind of intellectual property that's involved. There may be even more going forward with fintech, but intellectual property is not one of the great assets of the financial world. It's their expertise, et cetera. So that'd be okay, but it's I think a relatively minor issue.
Congressman, we are going to switch now to some questions from our audience. There's a whole large number of questions. We cannot go through all of them, but a first one from Francis Chow. It does not tell me where the origin of that person is, but what will be Biden's stance on what people like to call globalization? In other words, will this sort of America first and sort of shedding as much as possible alliances and so on, a kind of neo-isolationism, will that prevail, or will that be dialed back under Biden?
It'll be dialed back significantly, more frankly, than I would do. I mean, one area where I agree with Trump is that I and a former colleague, Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder, years ago were arguing that we should ask our European allies to spend more on the military so we could spend less. But in the area of alliances, there will be a complete reversal. Biden will be a strong supporter of NATO. He will, I think, rejoin the climate treaty. He will be willing to reinstate the Iran nuclear agreement, hoping things haven't been too poisoned there. So you will see, and as I said, answering the question about China, I think much more coordination with this Quad, whatever they're calling it, but Australia and India and Japan. No, you will not see any isolationism in the non-economic area. So that, let's separate out globalization and isolationism. There'll be no, he will be back to a traditional role. In fact, more willing than I think is in our legitimate interest to be a leader of the world. That will include, by the way, I think, a strong affirmation of support for the de facto independence of Taiwan. Secondly, though, in globalization, the ideal of the Biden administration is one that several of us tried to get both Clinton and Obama to do and didn't do. It's to say globalization is a good thing as long as it is done in a way that either fully shares the benefits of globalization within the country or compensates its victims. I mean, that has been the problem. I don't question that globalization, increased trade, has increased American GDP. The problem is that the distribution, it's been very unfair. It has diminished the share of a lot of working people and enhanced the share of others. So what Biden will try to do is to, if you get better health care, one of the problems we have with trade politically has been when people lose their jobs in a globalizing world, they lose their health care, they don't get adequate shelter. To the extent that we can provide better health care, bring down housing costs, that reduces the blow. So the answer was too long. Short term, there's going to be an effort to pursue economic integration with more effort to see that the benefits and burdens of that are more fairly shared.
Drilling down to particulars, one of our listeners asked, will Biden continue the Trump policy of crushing Huawei's 5G efforts? That, of course, has been one of China's big complaints, claiming that American policy has been bullying and unfair to single out Huawei, their national champion in telecommunications. Might be too specific, but that's certainly on people's minds.
I think that, first place, obviously, it's not easy to do a 180 reversal. And to the extent that that's become, to a significant extent, it's become a symbol of politically. And Biden is not going to simply be able to say, okay, well, hey, China's our pal and we can work with them. I think what you will probably see is an approach that says Biden would be willing to make some changes if there was something in return. But a kind of a largely unilateral rescission of the anti-Huawei policy is politically impossible in America, even if he wanted to do it.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Dave.
On a different topic, one of our listeners asks, do you see America as a country that defines itself along racist lines? Why or why not? I guess that's the issue, whether we're systematically or systemically racist. I know that's been a major issue, at least at the extremes of the political spectrum. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. The answer, I think, is that we are historically racist. And we have been for 80 years or so, since World War II, I guess. What is that, about 90 years or so? We have been on a path away from racism, but it is slow, it is incomplete. We have made enormous strides. There's no question that there is much less systematic racism in America today than there was even 40 years ago. But yes, there are still elements of it. And part of it is history leaves its mark. There is still a problem in African Americans in particular, and people of Latin descent being placed in positions of authority. Again, that's a hangover from the employment pool you have today is partly the product of the practices of 20 and 30 years ago. We are doing a much better job of diminishing that discriminatory policy at the outset. Also, people have tended, in many ways, people talk about systemic racism, and people say, well, I'm not a racist. No, but if you are the CEO or members of the executive hierarchy, and every one of your friends is a white guy, and occasionally a white woman, and everybody you do business with, you are going to tend to hire and deal more with them, not because you don't like black people, because you don't know any. So the question is, who are you going to hire? You have to make a conscious effort. Colin Powell said, and that's, by the way, what was meant by affirmative action. If you just go by the normal rules, people are going to hire people like them, their friends, their circle. It takes an active policy to break that. Colin Powell said if we didn't have affirmative action, not quotas, not requirements, he'd never have been a general. And so we are making some progress on that. But history hasn't loosed its grip. And it has been true clearly with law enforcement. It's a vicious cycle. The disorganization, the social and economic disorganization that the country inflicted on black communities has led to more social violence there. That's been true of every ethnic group. That there were two cycles in America with ethnicity, two areas of activity that follow an ethnic cycle. One is boxing, and the other is organized crime. If you look at boxing in America, the Irish were succeeded by the Italians, who were succeeded by the African Americans, who have been succeeded by the Latinos in terms of who were the major boxing champions. Because as people began to get other lines of work available, getting punched in the head no longer seemed quite the best way to make a living. Similarly with organized crime. The mafia has largely disappeared because being an Italian American now, you don't face these restrictions that make you say, well, this is the best way to make a living. And I think that's the problem has been with regard to the African American community, because economic and social disorganization has been there. You have had the problem of young men who have thought, well, this is the only way I can really make a living. And you've had this violence that has developed a predisposition on the part of a lot of police officers, I think, to react differently and worse. You also had the very discriminatory and stupid prohibitionist drug policy. And yeah, that has resulted in law enforcement of a systemic pattern. And I have to say here, the police are partly to blame. That one of the things that we have to erase from our culture is this notion that informing lawful authorities of wrongdoing is a bad thing. We got to stop talking about people who rat people out, or that snitches get stitches. And we have two places where it happens. It happens in the minority community, where there is this sense that don't cooperate with the authorities and the cops will tell you correctly that when they try to solve crimes, they run into the problem of people who are either afraid to tell them things that they know, or that don't think ideologically they should. But there's an equal problem: the refusal of police to acknowledge grave misbehavior by their own. This blue wall of science. If you look at the TV, you notice in every TV series about police, it is presented as a good thing that the cops hate the cops who investigate cops, that the internal investigators are bad people. And I hope we can change that, and both sides have to understand. No, cops should stop protecting cops who misbehave, and minority communities should stop protecting people who commit violence, primarily against other members of the minority communities.
Can we return briefly to the more domestic theme of income inequality? One of our listeners just wants to know how is tax policy, how is regulatory policy, how is corporate governance policy going to be handled under a Biden administration so as to actually produce better income inequality. We have seen that the tax cuts that were given to corporations were largely used for, share buybacks. That obviously produces no equality, but the very opposite. Is there anything in the works where this theme is actually going to come to the fore?
Very good. No, I agree that the economic benefits of the tax cut have been to help the people who own things, but it has done nothing noticeable to increase investment, again, because people don't invest to get a tax cut. They invest to be able to sell a product. And I do think that that's why the demand side is so important in this. But secondly, I do want to say, by the way, one short, in favor of government regulation. Sometimes you need government regulation because responsible companies want to do certain things, but they are afraid or inhibited from doing them because competitors will not do them. And therefore they have to keep up. It's what former head of Citibank said, when the music is playing, you got to dance. I asked Chuck Prince when he was CEO why they were engaging in this notion of where you took debt of the company and put it in a structured investment vehicle so it didn't show up on your books, although it was your debt. And I said, what's the justification for that? He said, well, if I don't do it and Goldman does, then I lose out my shareholder, I lose out in the market. I think there was a lot of resistance to the share buybacks on the part of people who run corporations, particularly when they had other useful opportunities to invest that money. But competitive pressure did it. I can tell you that, and I've talked to executives who said, I don't want to do share buybacks. They don't do anything, but all the stock, all the investment companies tell me this. So when the Fed banned big banks from doing share buybacks, I think a lot of them, you didn't hear much protest. I think a lot of them welcomed that. In terms of tax policy, Biden will raise taxes on upper income people. And the fact is that there's a lot of room to do that before you begin to impinge on economics. In fact, the Republicans, first George W. Bush and then Obama and the Republican Congresses, reduced to some extent the upper end taxes that Clinton had levied. Obama tried to put them back up. There's no correlation in gross economic activity with that. The notion that people will be deterred by an increase in the capital gains tax from 20% to 28%. I'm only going to make a 72% return and not an 80. There's no showing of that. In terms of the personal, I think, no question, you look at the very wealthiest, and if you ask them how much income tax they pay, they have to ask their accountants. They have no idea. I mean, so, no, I think there will be some increase there. My own approach will be, and when I think you will see an increase in the most progressive thing in the American economy is also funds one of the most progressive, and it's the payroll tax that funds Social Security. And if you are a married couple, each of you making $80,000 a year, you pay more total dollars in Social Security tax than a single individual making $200,000 because there's a cap. That cap will be raised. I believe the best thing we could do, both for productivity, for the economy, and the diminishing inequality, would be to exempt the first $30,000 or $40,000 of income, look at the numbers, from the payroll tax and replace that with other income. The problem with Trump's proposal this year was he wanted to suspend collection of the payroll tax and not replace it with anything, which would have increased the problem of financing Social Security and Medicare going forward. So there will be some move towards tax fairness. There are a couple other things that we can do. One of the most important things that we can do is to restore the power of people to join unions. It is now clear that the war on unions that Ronald Reagan began and successfully carried out when he fired all the air controllers has diminished workers' power. And in particular, what we need to do is to find a way to give the rights to people in the non-manufacturing area. Service sector unionization is the best thing that we could do to raise income. And I think you will see a supportive administration. One of the areas doesn't get a lot of public attention, but if you're looking for a sign that parties have changed, look at the rulings of the National Labor Relations Board, which is always 3-2. That's the statute. No party could have more than 3 members of the 5-member board. So you will see a restoration of labor. The third thing is to increase the public policies that diminish the effect of inequality. Healthcare is one. I'd say second, I hope that they will be, and I think finally this has got people's attention, housing costs are way too high. So I think you may also see a significant effort to build more housing, and not just housing for lower income people. This is a case where if you increase the supply, it will have a good effect. So there'll be tax policy. There'll be, I think, support for unions and trying to help the people in the service sector raise their wages, also by minimum wages. And people have said, by the way, oh, well, some people like to be gig workers. They don't want to be full-time. I think that choice should be preserved, but in a way that gives the gig workers some access to pensions and healthcare so that they don't pay a tremendous economic penalty for it. And then expanding particularly public sector activities that don't in themselves diminish inequality, but diminish the negative impact of inequality, particularly in the areas of healthcare, housing, and education.
Thank you. We have a question regarding COVID-19, but before I ask it, I'm obligated to make a brief word from our sponsor. Please do subscribe to Asia Times. Your subscriptions will make these events possible. We appreciate your support. And with that, the Trump administration's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has been a major political issue. It's been heavily criticized by your party. Would we see a material change in the federal approach to the pandemic in the Biden administration?
It would be one of the biggest areas of change. One of the problems you have when you're trying to make public policy is that in some cases, you can't do experiments because the way to test a particular policy requires some people to participate in it and others not to. And you can't refuse to allow people to do things that are in their benefit. You can't create a control group. So what you look for are natural experiments where some people voluntarily do something and other people voluntarily do not. Well, the Republicans have given us that in COVID for the past, most of this year. At the national political level, Republicans and the people they associate with have refused to wear masks on the whole, have dismissed the notion of social distancing. Democrats, on the other hand, have largely followed that. And the result has been a great deal of COVID infection among the Republicans who have chosen not to wear masks and to get close to each other, and very little among the national Democrats. I'm serious. When people look at that, it's a rare and very graphic natural experiment. There will be encouragement to wear masks. There will be serious discouragement of social gatherings over a certain number, particularly indoors. So that means in the winter months in much of the country, you don't have them. There will be much more care in the vaccine. And by the way, I think that's essential because if Trump is in power with his attacks on public health and a vaccine is developed, there will be much more skepticism about taking it, which obviously defeats the purpose to a great extent. So I think you will see a much greater compliance. I know you'll see a much greater compliance with the scientific consensus. There won't be any perpetuating of the notion of herd immunity, and there will be more lockdowns, more close downs, better example setting at the federal level.
And Congressman, there's been a remarkable recent rapprochement between some parts of the Arab world and Israel. How will this continue? Arguably one of the successes of the Trump administration, one of the few. Will this development actually continue under a Biden administration?
I hope so. I give Trump credit for this. I've been critical of much of what he did, but I think this has been helpful. I hope Sudan follows by recognizing Israel, because it has been among the countries that have been peripheral to the dispute. You don't see this from the core countries, but I think that is a useful thing. Unfortunately, I think we've run out of countries that fall into that category. These have been UAE and the other. They've been more peripheral to this, and they are also countries. Well, not Sudan, but where public opinion is not a very big factor. Because I think to go much further, you're going to need to see a change in Israeli policy. Yes, I think this is a good trend, but I think to go beyond where we are now in terms of the number of countries that are supportive, I think you have to work with regimes to diminish public opposition. And I think one of the big changes you will see is a change in American policy, not towards Israel, but towards Netanyahu, who I think has been a negative force on the whole. And it depends, but if the Biden presidency has the effect of supporting the opposition to Netanyahu, and you've got a government in power in Israel that was less focused on Netanyahu's very narrow agenda of keeping the right happy enough to keep him in power, then I think you would go beyond that. But I think we've unfortunately run out of countries. I think it's a good trend, but I think we've run out of countries that are able to do this until there's some change in Israeli policy. Now, obviously, the Israelis understand that because they gave up the notion of the incorporation legally of some of the Palestinian lands, but they need to go beyond that. But it's also, though, it depends in part. And Netanyahu, my problem with Netanyahu is he has become much of a problem recently, as the PLO has long been. And again, as I said, I am critical of some what America does with regard to China, but China is the problem. I do think it was the old quote from Abba Eban, the great Israeli statesman, who said that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I think, the deals that were offered under Bill Clinton, for example, with Ehud Barak, those now look like, boy, wouldn't it be great to have them? So again, short answer, I think Biden would like to continue that trend, but there's going to be some effort to try and change Israeli policy, because I think that is the essential step to adding to the Arab countries that would have the political stability to be able to do that.
Congressman, if I could return to American politics for our last question, because we're getting to the end of the hour. The consensus now has Biden winning the presidency quite clearly. The Senate remains a toss-up. What would you think the political outlook would be if we had a Biden presidency with a split Congress?
It would be favorable from my standpoint. Here's the deal. The House will clearly be Democratic. And between Biden and the House under the leadership, frankly, one of the great figures in American political history, Nancy Pelosi. She's been for some time the most important woman in American history, literally, politically. But now she's becoming one of the major figures. I think what you'll see is their collaboration to send some legislation to the Senate, which will increase the pressure on the Republican members of the Senate who are up for re-election, particularly to be supportive. That is, I think, Mitch McConnell's ability, if he stays as majority leader, and I think he's been the most destructive force for a long time. People ask, when did American politics go off the rails in terms of excessive bipartisanship? It's Mitch McConnell. In 2008, I was one of the Democrats who worked very closely with the Bush administration to respond to the crisis of 2008. I'm very proud of the nice things that all the high-ranking Bush economic officials said about me in their memoirs, Sheila Bair and Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson. So the Democrats delivered for Bush in 2008. When Obama becomes president, Mitch McConnell announces that his number one priority is to deny him re-election. And that was the end of a significant downdrop in the cooperation. In fact, Obama didn't see it coming. He had said, running for president, that he was going to have a post-partisan administration. I said at the time, because I knew how bad the Republicans were likely to become, that gave me post-partisan depression, because I knew it would have negative impact. But the question is, will the effect of McConnell, of the Republican defeat, lead enough Republicans to tell McConnell, okay, this has got to stop. And this opposition has got to end, and we've got to work with the Democrats. That's especially the case as if I think if the Republicans do hold the Senate, it will be because a couple of incumbent Republican senators won by the smallest margins in their life. And I think that's going to encourage other Republicans, particularly Republicans who face re-election in 2022, to say to McConnell, no, we just can't go into universal opposition. And when the House sends bills over, that's going to force a considerable movement. And especially because I think Biden and Nancy Pelosi will sensibly, in conjunction with Chuck Schumer, send legislation over from the House that will have a great appeal to the electorate. And that will pressure a lot of Republicans to de-Trumpify themselves in the future election.
Congressman, that's nearly a Solomonic solution here that you're offering that perhaps could create a situation in which the great divisions in the American political scene might, if not be overcome, at least we would take certain steps in that direction. We have come toward or to the end of our webinar here. We thank you very, very much and are extremely appreciative of the very wide range of knowledge and wisdom in your remarks and in your discussion with us. And I thank everybody else who participated through answering questions. And of course, David, I thank you for incisive questioning. So with that, I'd like to close this webinar, and on behalf of Asia Times, thank everyone for participation and for subscribing to our great newspaper. Thank you very much.
And I am glad to be supportive of the Asia Times, which is a very constructive force.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman.